Before he was trying to replace Justin Trudeau as the leader of the Liberal Party, Mark Carney was an economic record breaker. After his time as governor of the Bank of Canada, Carney was hired by the man next to him in these photos to become the first non-Brit to captain the central bank across the pond. Carney served as governor of the Bank of England from 2013 to 2020. Joining us now to discuss his thoughts on the leadership candidate is George Osborne, who served as the UK's Chancellor of the Exchequer during Carney's tenure with the Bank of England. George Osborne, it's good to meet you, sir. Thank you for being here today.
Thanks for having me on.
When you initially approached Mark Carney for this role as the governor of your central bank, he said no. What was it that convinced you that he was the right person for that job?
Well, I was determined to get him because my responsibility as Britain's finance minister at the time was to find the very best person in the world to be the governor of the Bank of England. And I concluded that the very best person wasn't British, which was quite an unusual decision. The first time in our long history of that job that someone had ever come to that view. And I'd come across Mark because he was, of course, governor of the Bank of Canada. And, I'd come across him on the international circuit at these important conferences like the G20 and the G7. And I thought, that is the guy that I want to get. And of course, the first time I asked him, he was understandably, I think, reluctant to give up being governor of the Bank of Canada. And of course, his family was in Ottawa. And so it took a lot of persuading because he's a proud Canadian. But I persuaded him at least for a few years to cross the Atlantic and help us out in London.
But what was it about his track record, though, with the Bank of Canada? Because he had been there during the subprime mortgage global financial crisis sort of caused by the U.S. banking and insurance system. But what was it that you saw in his performance and qualities that made him your pick to be the first non-Brit to run the British bank?
Well, I think he had two things when I saw him, in these conferences and explaining what the Canadian Central Bank was up to. He had two great qualities. The first was, real technical knowledge. And that is, he's on top of the detail. He knows his stuff. And of course, you need that in someone who's the governor of your central bank. But quite often, to be honest, the governors of central banks are not very good at communicating and they're not very good at explaining. And sometimes they don't see the bigger picture. And Mark, I felt was very good at that. And so he combined kind of expertise with an ability to connect and an ability to see where, important as it was, the central bank fitted in the bigger picture of what was going on in the world.
It was reported, I think, by The Guardian in 2012 that Carney only accepted the job because an opening in Canadian politics had disappeared for the time being. So there were reports going back over a decade of an interest in politics. Did you think at the time that Mark Carney had his eye on elected politics for a while?
Well, I know that, of course, Mark is a Liberal, and I knew that. And by the way, I am a Conservative, and I was a Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer. I know that the then Harper government were pretty reluctant to see him go and kind of fought to keep him. And I always knew that, of course, he had an interest in democratic politics, as you would as someone interested in economic policy and what's going on in the world. But obviously, I knew that once he committed to serve his time as governor of the Bank of England, he would be good to his word. And he did a very great service for our country. And then, of course, the moment the clock was up, he went back to Canada.
When he was recruited, your economy was in pretty rough shape, as a lot of economies were, sort of coming out of the financial crisis of a decade and a half ago. Central banks was struggling. Do you think he did, as governor of the Bank of England, what you hired him to do?
Yes, I mean, there were two things I really hired him to do, and then there was one thing which he had to do, which I wish he hadn't had to do. So I'll explain. First of all, the economy was in the doldrums in 2012, 2013, post the financial crisis, which had been very big in Britain because we've got such a big banking sector. And he helped in partnership with me, and he was able to work, as Americans would say, across the aisle, with a Conservative Chancellor to get the British economy growing again. And by 2013, 2014, we were really motoring again. And I think that kind of partnership with the central bank where, he was very self-confident about the independence of the central bank, but he was nevertheless happy to work in tandem with the elected government was really important. Second, he actually modernized the Bank of England. I mean, the Bank of England has been around for, hundreds of years, but it always needs updating and cultural change while not losing kind of its soul. And I think he was very effective at that. Of course, the crisis that he really had to deal with, much to my disappointment, because I didn't want this to happen to my country, was Brexit, when Britain voted to leave the EU. And that was a real shock to the markets, who hadn't been expecting the result. It wasn't what the polls suggested. And the Bank of England was right in the firing line. And the first voice really that people heard in Britain, who had gone to sleep and woken up to hear the result, that suddenly we were leaving the EU, was Mark. He went on television very early on at about 7 a.m. and told Britons it was okay. The Bank of England was there to protect them and to hold their hand in this crisis, and the markets were plunging at that moment. And I think it's such an interesting, there are lots of, people who are civil servants, who are bank governors, bank officials, and this is no disrespect to them, but they would not want to put their head above the parapet at that point. They would say, let's leave it to the kind of elected politicians who got us into this mess to get us out of it. But he knew it was his duty, I think, as governor of the Bank of England, to step forward, and we discussed it in advance. And I'd always said, look, I'll do it if you don't want to. But I also knew he would have more authority at that moment. And he calmed the markets through his force of personality, and people knew, that we had someone, there was someone in charge, because there was a moment when the kind of politicians had looked like they deserted the ship. And so it was, I think the British people turned on their television or turned on their radio at the time, and they thought, okay, someone's in charge, and that was Mark.
Well, this is interesting, because this is one of the core selling points in his pitch for the leadership of the Liberal Party here and to be Prime Minister, that and his work with Prime Minister Harper and Finance Minister Jim Flaherty during the financial crisis, and in particular how it relates to the economic threat and disruption coming from Washington right now under President Trump. So, Brexit's a little bit different, because it was kind of self-inflicted, as opposed to this is an external challenge Canada is facing. So what is the lesson from there, or the experience from there, that he could apply to what we're getting from the White House right now?
Well, I think I'll make a sort of broader point, which is, I hope, an answer to your question. Because, by the way, here in Britain, we've got many of the same challenges dealing with. You want someone who is going to represent your country, have confidence in their own skin, not be intimidated by Donald Trump, and that's quite hard. He's quite an intimidating, difficult person to deal with, who has the kind of technical knowledge, is on top of the brief, so they're not going to be sort of outfoxed in the negotiation, but also has the kind of street smart of how to deal with a big, complex international negotiation. And Mark has been in the room where it happens, as they say in that great musical Hamilton. He's seen it many times over and over again. And I think, if I was sending someone in to bat on behalf of Canada, I'd want Mark Carney, because I'd say this is the moment we need our most experienced international statesperson. And, I have great respect for Krista, and, I work with the Trudeau government, and I work a lot with the Harper government. But, at the moment, the person, the Canadian with the most international experience in the whole of Canada is Mark Carney. And he's running. He's chosen to run. So, he seems to me like the person you would want at this time. And I say this as someone who was, as I say, politically a conservative, not a liberal. And you need to send in your top guy, because that Trump is a very difficult person to deal with and to negotiate with. And of course, the United States, we feel this in Britain, is a much bigger economy, and in some sense holds quite a lot of the cards. So you've got to also be able to play the hand really well.
Just as a final point, there is in the room, the ability to deal with the complex technocratic functions of economies and negotiations. But you ran David Cameron's leadership campaign. You've run for office. There is a retail component to politics where you have to connect with ordinary people. You've been a central banker or, a senior finance official in the case of Mr. Carney for all of your life, well-paid jobs with the Bank of England and the Bank of Canada. What's your sense of his ability to do that sort of retail politics and connect with Canadian voters should he win this thing? Because this has been the criticism coming from his critics from the Conservative Party here in particular, is that he's kind of an out-of-touch guy who doesn't understand how normal people think and feel.
Well, look, my understanding, Mark's own personal background is he comes from small-town Canada, Western Canada, and so that's his. He may have made his career on the international stage, but good. That's all to his credit, given where he started off in life. And I guess I would make a kind of again this point, which is, I know there's been a kind of general trend towards sort of populists, and you've seen that, of course, in Donald Trump, and you see it in lots of European countries, including my own at the moment. But there's also a moment when maybe a country wants someone who knows what they're doing. Maybe a country wants someone who's an expert. Maybe they want someone who's got a lot of expertise and a lot of experience. And I would feel at the moment for Canada, this might be the moment. And Mark, has communicated as a central bank governor, of course, to the public. I talked about that really important television address to the British people on the morning after Brexit. That was political communication. And I've been an elected politician for almost 20 years. I know all about effective communication, and he has it. And I just I think there might be a moment when maybe we don't want another populist who's not that experienced and doesn't really know what they're doing, and maybe we do want someone who does know what they're doing. That would be my observation.
George Osborne, former UK Chancellor of the Exchequer. It was good to meet you, sir. Thank you for your time today.
Thanks for having me on.